So as is mentioned, we have a lot of content to provide. So I start right away. I'm Pierre Lasou. I'm a librarian. I'm a scholarly communication librarian at University Laval and the chair of the OpenAIRE working group from CAL OpenAIRE collaboration. So what I will start with today is introducing the guidelines, which are key components to be compliant and to participate in the OpenAIRE initiative. The idea of the presentation is to provide information to help implementation. There will be a focus on two softwares, DSpace and Eprints, during my presentations. I will also not go through all the elements. You'll see that there's a lot of, plenty of it, plenty of metadata elements to be compliant, but I will emphasize on funding and open access elements, which were two key component of the CAL collaboration working group for OpenAIRE. So basically participating in OpenAIRE is to go through 4 steps. Those steps, you can find them in a more detailed way in the decision tree, which is on CAL OpenAIRE collaboration documentation website. There's four steps. The first 2, technical and metadata, I will be explaining them in this presentation, and you will have an overview of the validation and registration process in the second session. So the guidelines that interest us today is the guidelines for literature repositories. It's version 4 guidelines. When you're talking to be compliant with OpenAIRE, you need to follow those guidelines. There's 32 elements in it. There's different requirements level to each element. It can be mandatory if applicable, recommended, or optional. So when we talk about a guideline, it's basically these websites that give an overview, a complete overview of the different elements and all the documentation you need to implement. The OpenAIRE is requiring the OAI PMH protocol to participate. Compliance to the guideline is mandatory. You need to implement some elements if you want to participate. You also need to be registered in OpenDoor. Without it, you cannot participate. Basically, what you need to do is to create a specific metadata format in your OAI implementation, the OAI OpenAIRE format. And the work that needs to be done is to map metadata from your repositories to the metadata, corresponding metadata OpenAIRE. A few words about the aggregation part of the OpenAIRE platform. As an aggregator, OpenAIRE will do 2 things with your record. The first one is conduct a dedupe process once you're registered. What is important to note is that OpenAIRE is not deleting your record, it's just merging or enriching existing records with your data. There's also a synchronization process, which is to say, if you delete a record from your ER, OpenAIRE will be deleting reference to it in its platform. So for more technical question like this, I encourage you to read the FAQ on the CAL documentation website. Basically, when you're dealing with the guidelines, you have a choose to pass. You can decide to implement only mandatory elements. You can decide to implement an intermediary version, let's say the Canadian Light Guidelines, which has been provided by ORWG, which contain 14 elements, metadata elements, or you can go with the full implementation of all the metadata elements. However, to help you implement, there's 2 important technical components that has been developed. One for DSpace, we call it the OpenAIRE patch. It has been developed by ForScience, funded by Canadian. It has been funded by Canadian universities, and basically, the patch, the OpenAIRE compliant part of the patch is planned to be added in DSpace 6.4. For version 5 of DSpace, there's no official plan of integration right now, and this version is a community-driven version. So if no people from the community is taking this work to be done, it remains like this. So it's a separate patch from the core DSpace distribution. If you opt for DSpace 7, it will include compliance out of the box. Again, on this patch, I encourage is that there's documentation on CAL OpenAIRE documentation website with the document called ForScience DSpace code implementation. The patch is provided with 21 metadata element already implemented. So For Science has worked with the standard metadata of DSpace to do those mappings. But when you're taking the code from the patch, you have this compliance with the 21 elements. There's also another technical development that has been made for Eprints, a plugin which has been developed by Concordia University. It's a free plugin. You can download it, and it's also open to contribution. Right now, the plugin offers has implemented 6 elements, all the mandatory elements necessary to participate, the minimum requirement to participate, but also one for the embargo period date. So now I'd focus on some elements, some metadata elements. Here you see the funding reference. One important thing to say right away is that it's not an element you will need to implement, and I explain myself in the second slide. Regarding this, it's one of the most complex elements of the guidelines because it has a lot of sub elements in it. You can make multi-reference founders. You can add their name, their IDs, the award title, which is a project that has been financed, that this publication is part of, sorry. So it's a very difficult one to implement in the current software. One of the challenge with the funding reference, it's hard to add manually when you're dealing with ER. It's an information it's difficult to add. So OpenAIRE has 2 solutions to help with these elements. The first one is to data mine the text, but to do so, you will need to implement the element called file location, so that OpenAIRE can grab your PDF, scan it, and extract the information founders. There's also a way, I mentioned briefly the enrichment process. So OpenAIRE is cross-referencing records. So maybe you can find other information on funding of other funding information in other records, like in Crossref records, for example, or other source to enrich your record with funding information. The other elements I want to focus on is on those who deal with open access, which means the free access to content, which can happen at both the item level and the file level with the guidelines, and the license level, the license open access, which only occur at the moment at the item level. There's 4 elements for open access: access right, file location, embargo period date, and license condition. Let's review each one. Access right is where you will mention the access status, let's say, of the item. So one important thing when you're dealing with access right is that it needs to comply to the access right vocabulary from core. This vocabulary is providing 4 tags, let's say, to identify your content: open access, embargoed access, restricted access, and metadata only access. This element, access right, is both available in the Eprint plugin and in DSpace 5 and 6. You can also indicate the access condition in the file location elements. So this is important. When you have an item with multiple files, you will be able to say if some are restricted or some are open access or embargoed in the same item. So you can do that with the access right attribute of this element. Again, for this attribute, you will need to comply with the core access right element. This element file location is not available in the Eprint plugin. It is in DSpace patch 5 and 6. Another one, the embargo period date. This one is conditional to the previous one, the access right. If you use the tag embargoed access in the access right elements, you will need to add an embargo period date. This one is quite specific. It's using the datasite vocabulary. So you need to, what you need to do to indicate an embargo, you will need to have two dates. One with the date type accepted, which is basically the publication date, the start date of the embargo, and another one which is available, which will indicate the end of the embargo. The embargo date is already implemented in the Eprint plugin and in DSpace 5 and 6 patch. Finally, the license condition. So the license condition is a specific element of the OpenAIRE guidelines. You can provide the licensing information, but you can also put here, let's say the copyright statement of an item if you do not provide Creative Commons. Right now, in the Eprint plugin does not have this license condition elements, and the DSpace patch is only providing it if you have declared with the item a CC BY license. Otherwise, it's not exposed. The license is not exposed. So, what I encourage you to do is if you use Eprint, use the Eprint plugin, or maybe also help to improve it. As I mentioned, there's some elements that have been made so that you can use it and register, but it would be a good idea to help improve it by adding, for example, the file location or the license information. Regarding the DSpace patch, important thing is the caution. I would say caution is required for some part of the code. Here you can look at the documents on the CAL documentation website, the 4 science DSpace code implementation, because some part of the code may cause problems or dependencies when you will be trying to migrate to, let's say, DSpace 7. So all the details are in this document. Now, how you can stay tuned with OpenAIRE and the initiative, the guidelines, and other activities. The CAL OpenAIRE, Open Repository Working Group continues its activities next year, so it's a good tribune to have access to this information. But I encourage you also to use the information tool from OpenAIRE directly. You can subscribe to a content provider newsletters, which provide information for content providers on some improvement or new roadmaps. You can also attend content provider community calls. It's a monthly event that usually you meet with the community and can exchange and see what's going on with the platforms and the new developments. Okay. I have the feeling I've sped up on this one, but this is it for mine. I can leave the floor to Cyndie and Tomasz.
Sounds good. I'll just get the NRC slides up.
Maybe Marc can try out his mic, because I think he's joined us since we started.
Yes, that would be good.
I have. Does it sound all right?
Fantastic.
And I just want to double check here. You can see our first slide. And you can now see, oh, that's interesting. There we go. You can now see our second slide.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to take my mic off and leave it to Marc.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about registration and validation for the OpenAIRE guidelines. The logical place to start would be registration. Once you go on to the OpenAIRE provide link, you'll be, if you're not registered yet, you'll be met with this page, which basically says that you got to register a repository. So pretty straightforward. You click on register. Next slide, please. So after you click register, you have an option to choose what kind of repository you want to register. For the first one here, we're going to do literature repository. And then the next thing you'll see, you have to find your repository in OpenDoor. And as Pierre said, you have to be registered in OpenDoor in order to participate here. So we were able to, you can filter out with the drop down by country, and then you can do some more filtering if you put in the text that you want. There's a little text search at the top. So we put in NRC, and we were fortunate enough to find the NRC publication archive, which is the one that we wanted to register for our literature repository here. And that will bring you forward to basically a profile page, which is auto-populated by OpenDoor. So we kind of went over our information for this one. And it asks you to confirm it, but any changes that you make here, I don't think they're replicated back to OpenDoor. So it'll pull the info, and any changes you make, it should save to your profile on the OpenAIRE, but it won't replicate it back. So if you want to make changes to OpenDoor, you'll have to go there directly. When we ended up pulling the information, our information in OpenDoor was, we had that set up quite some time ago by none of us who are working on it right now. So we went over everything, and we had others selected for the software platform. There were some options that were partially applicable because our software integrates it has a lot of different parts to it. So one of the software options, for example, was Fedora, which we do use Fedora, but I wouldn't say that it's not only Fedora in a way. So we decided to go with other, just so that there's no confusion that it was exactly what we're doing. One other thing that was kind of interesting was our longitude and latitude coordinates were here. I'm not sure how they got there. I would think that they were looked up by some sort of process through our address that we provided. But we did go through and actually verify, and that does point to our NRC Montreal Road campus in Ottawa. The one thing we did have to change, though, was the time zone wasn't correct for us. So we ended up just updating that on here. And then you'll go on to the next page after you've confirmed all your information for the profile. The next page is to actually define which endpoint you want to be using. So you put in the base URL for your OAI PMH implementation, and then you can optionally specify which set you would like to harvest, which is useful if you don't want your whole repository harvested. We did, however, hear that this kind of set restriction wasn't actually working for another group. But for us, as far as we could tell, it seemed to be working. And then after you go to finish, and yeah, they'll send you to this page here, which they'll tell you to expect an email, which sure enough, once you take a look at your inbox. Oh, I thought we had a screenshot for the inbox. Anyway, they do send a confirmation email. Maybe that's for the validation we had that.
Yeah, that's for the validation.
Yeah. So yeah, the registration portion is fairly painless, or at least for the literature repository. However, for us, after that, we tried to register a data repository here. And one of the issues was it's required that you're registered in our Re3 data here. So unfortunately for us, we're not actually primarily like a data repository. We have like a data set collection within our digital repository. However, it's just a small subset. So we ended up looking at the FAQs about Re3 data and everything, which I think is on the next slide here. And they were saying that the repository must have a focus on research data, which, we don't feel that that's us. We do have some research data, but it's not our focus. So we don't think it's applicable to be registered with Re3 data. And Therefore, we can't really register our data archive as a repository for OpenAIRE. But the final thoughts here, for literature repository, you've got to be an open door for it to show up in that list. Data repository, it looks like you've got to be in re3 data. Unfortunately, we don't know what it looks like moving forward for the data repository, so we can't speak too much to that. But after those after you're registered for those two, you can register for the OpenAIRE, and it's, as far as we can tell, it's fairly painless. So next we'll talk about the validation. And for validation, the whole registration process makes this slightly easier in that once you're registered, you get a drop down of which repository you want to be validating against. Alternatively, if you're not registered, which is how we did the validation previously, was you can just manually enter URL, the base URL for OAI-PMH that you want to be validating. The second page, they're going to get you to pick which guideline you want to be validating against. You can also specify specific fields if that interests you. Every time I've done it, I've always just validated everything. It'll give you a big list. So I haven't played around with that too much, but I think it's pretty straightforward. And then the third page here, you can further limit things by the number of records, as well as the specific set, once again, that you want to be validating. And the way this works, as far as I can tell, is they'll query your, part of OAI-PMH is a list sets verb. So they'll query your list sets verb, and then they're going to populate the dropdown here with all of the sets that your OAI-PMH endpoint exposes. And once after that, you just click validate, and then, yeah, once again, they're going to send an email for this one here. Yeah, there we go. There's the email, as expected. The validation process for us as well we validated, I think it was 68,000 records or something along those lines, a little above 60,000 maybe actually. And that took about 45 minutes as far as I remember. So, if you're using a smaller set, the validation is fairly quick. And you can see results here. There's a page for validation history, which will look like this. Yeah, you got color coding, it's nice. It'll tell you the previous results. And if you want any more information, you can select the view results as well, which it'll give you some nice graphs. On the right, you've got the score for your usage and your content. There'll be a table underneath with rows for each OpenAIRE element, and it'll basically tell you the number of records that use that element. It'll tell you the status of it, and so on and so forth. If you have any problems, you'll see this little guy that says view warnings. And if you click on the view warnings, it'll give you a pop-up of 10 records. I'm guessing it's just the first 10 off the top that do not comply to this field. Now, for example, this one that we have here is the size field, which not all of our records contain the size field. So of course, we're going to expect that it's not, it doesn't comply for those records. However, one issue that I found with this was they don't give you much more than that. They'll say, this is the guideline on the one column. So unstructured size information about the resource is the error that they give you, and then they'll give you the guideline and they'll give you 10 records. But again, for us, we know that that record doesn't have size. So for example, if we're looking at, this one has 8,600 records that have it, that's a good, like 52,000 records or something like that, which don't have the size. So Is it going to be the same error for all of them? I'm not sure. So you have to do a little bit of digging as far as the actual correction of any problems goes, but it will let you know if something is not quite right. And these are just warnings too, so it's not game breaking in any way. But there could also be like an error that you can find. Did you want to do the final thought, Cyndie?
Sure, Mark. We're actually running just a bit over time, so I'm going to breeze through these rather quickly. Some of them are just a bit of a highlighter emphasis of what Mark has already said, that the validation was useful, that sometimes we thought we understood the guidelines really well, and then we found that the mappings actually needed some tweaking. As Mark was just saying, we just pointed out that a lot of times the errors or warnings need a little bit of extra investigation because they might be misleading. There might actually not be a problem there, or not the problem quite that you think there is. We said the ability to set by limit by sets was useful. You can read that line later, and Mark talked about it earlier. One point that may not be useful for everyone here, but which a lot of people have told us they found interesting, so we included, was that within our collection, we have some protected A records, metadata records, that we don't want going out, but we're fine with them because we don't publicly share them. So of course, OAI-PMH is just taking what's publicly available. So the fact that they're behind our firewall and you need to be logged in to see them means that they're a bit of a, they give us a limit automatically. We just wanted to say, be aware of the substantial differences in the two guidelines, because I know that we implemented the literature one, had it running really smoothly, and then jumped to the data one and found that we had to do a lot more work to get everything to validate then. So it wasn't just get one running error-free, immediately be able to work with the other one. Make sure you understand the nuances in both. And we thought it was worth noticing that if you're, or noting that if your organization has OAI-PMH running already, that it makes it quite easy or reasonably fast and not too hard to put this in place. It's a little bit more work if you don't have OAI-PMH already and you have to get that going. And that ends our presentation, so I'll quickly turn it over so we don't lose too much time.
Thank you, Cyndie and Marc. And so I guess we're leading into Tomasz, and I'll let you introduce your section, Tomasz.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about the dashboard. So one of the advantages really of registering with OpenAIRE is you have access to this dashboard. It gives you information about the harvesting history, the associated metadata for the items harvested from your repository. It'll tell you how many records have been harvested, how many enrichments there are for these, and eventually, and if and when you enable this, information about statistics of usage that you are sharing with OpenAIRE, because that is an option. We don't have this enabled yet. So all of the information that was just covered now that you entered during registration is available for review and editing through the dashboard. There is also included in this is the OAI-PMH set that is used for validation. But I note here that what doesn't seem to be available here is the OAI-PMH set that is actually used for harvesting. And so in my attempt to control this, I've been actually writing emails to OpenAIRE support, but they tell me that this functionality is coming, though informally, to the interface as well. So you have here what it looks like, the dashboard, the aggregation history. This just tells you basic information about when records were collected and how many. Not a lot of detail, but still useful. So in a way that for me, one of the more interesting tabs is the Enrichments tab. So this contains detailed information about additional metadata for harvested records that OpenAIRE was able to gather, usually through matching up with other sources of information, such as Microsoft Academic Graph, DataCite, Unpaywall, whatever they were able to harvest as well themselves. So this is divided up into categories. So you have other versions of the item, persistent identifiers, some classification terms from archive, from Dewey Decimal System, the addition of abstracts, author ORCIDs, projects. One of the ones that appears a lot for us is, for example, publication date. And in general, the mapping in the ePrints date types to OpenAIRE date types required some thought, as the default date types in ePrints, which is submitted, published, and completed, needed to be mapped to a very different date types, which are available, issued, and accepted. So, but the fact actually that the publication date, it comes up as an enrichment activity, an enrichment is because actually for a while our repository was not requiring the date type to be set, and so there are actually some records that didn't have this set, and so it highlights something else that Cyndie was saying, that this exercise is also useful in terms of pinpointing maybe areas where you can review your own metadata and how to deal with either cleanup or additional mapping that you need to take into account. And so I'll go through some of these enrichments and show you some examples. So one of the most important functions really of OpenAIRE is that it dedupes its index. So in doing that, it identifies which items they are indexing are the same. And so in doing that, it's able to enrich your metadata with other copies, links to other copies. So this is an example of an article that also appears as an open access article in pattern recognition. It's a journal. So another enrichment type is the persistent identifiers. So there were 2000s of these associations made for our repository. So we didn't actually include the DOIs that we have in our repository in our export. And so a lot of these enrichments are DOIs that OpenAIRE is adding. But they also add PubMed Central, PubMed IDs, and you can see that on the slide for this article for Frontiers in Psychology, as it appears in our repository, and the PubMed Central ID that OpenAIRE associates to it. And you could see that there's also a PubMed ID and a DOI that OpenAIRE has for it as well. Another example is the archive subjects. So some of the content would have appeared in ePrint in the archive repository, and in this example, you see that it was able to extract for this journal article and in the lecture notes in computer science. It's able to extract the cryptography and security subject term from archives. So there are a dozen Dewey Decimal classifications as well, enrichments that it was able to find. So this one is for an article published in Genome Biology with many authors. And so it's likely to have many open access versions deposited in other repositories. And you could see that the Dewey Decimal classification for 570 for biology comes from the metadata from another repository, which is KitOpen. And it's also interesting to note that OpenAIRE has all of the ORCIDs for all of the authors. And this is one of these journal articles that has quite a lot of authors. One of the interesting things that it's also able to identify and enrich is the names of projects. And so there was 250 of those in our repository that it was able to find. 250 events. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's for distinct items, because it can identify each event as an instance of a piece of information that's being kind of enriched, but it could be multiple pieces of information for the same item. So in this case, you see projects from SSHRC and NSERC based on information from DataCite. There's actually a project name, the influence of sound on motor memory formation, which comes from the funders database, which is the Swiss National Science Foundation, which funded this research output. Also, CIHR identified through Unpaywall. And it's not a part of the dashboard, but after your repository is indexed in OpenAIRE Explorer, you have statistics that you can access that are public, actually, statistics about your repository. And it includes this nice graph of the different research funders that it was able to associate with your research. So yeah, the only other thing is that I recommend, I wanted to mention is that I recommend this integration was done by me with Eprints, and here you see the URL of the code and of where you can download and install the plugin if you are using Eprints. And if you have any questions, always please feel free also to reach out to me directly, and I'll be there also for the next session. Okay, so I pass it on to Gabriela now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll share my screen. Okay, I'm hoping that everyone can see my slides now. Hello, I'm Gabriela Mircea. I'm the Digital Repository Librarian at McMaster University Library. This presentation will provide an overview of the Canada Research Aggregator, present how to participate in Canada Research and how to curate the records. Okay, Canada Research is a metadata aggregator based at McMaster University. It currently focuses on aggregating records from non-compliant repositories and transforming their metadata to be made available for harvesting by OpenAIRE. Canada Research Aggregator is part of the Open Repositories Working Group's strategic vision for repositories, and it is helping to move the community forward so that research outputs from Canadian institutional repositories can be made available through international discovery services. So taking a step back now, the next few slides will look at the history of the project. Part of the Open Repositories Working Group mandate is to manage Canadian compliance with OpenAIRE Metadata Guidelines version 4.0 and get the content from our institutional repositories into the OpenAIRE infrastructure. As everyone in the audience probably knows, the Canadian institutional repositories landscape is a blend of various platforms. And the majority of institutional repositories are not compliant with the OpenAIRE requirements. The members of the Open Repositories Working Group recognize that some effort is required by repositories to become OpenAIRE compliant. And we understand that some repositories will choose not to adopt the OpenAIRE guidelines for several reasons. And some of the reasons could be the staff time needed to apply the technical adjustments or heavy customization of the repository. So we brainstormed how to get our goals and bridge the gap to support harvesting of all Canadian repositories by OpenAIRE. And the solution was indirect harvesting of institutional repositories by OpenAIRE through Canada Research. McMaster University Libraries have implemented a Canadian aggregator for institutions that do not have the resources or choose not to implement the OpenAIRE guidelines. And Canada Research harvests metadata from Canadian repositories and transforms the records to become compliant with the OpenAIRE guidelines. Canada Research also not only solves the technical problems, but having to work on a national aggregation project allowed us to build the workflows and gain valuable expertise that could be used to take on a more active role in managing, providing better access and tracking Canadian research outputs and activities. Canada Research is based on DSpace. DSpace has a harvester built in, and it can be applied to harvest content, both metadata and the bit streams, into DSpace from an external server using the Open Archives Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting, the OAI BMH, or the Open Archives Initiative Object Reuse and Exchange, the OAI-ORE, that allows for full text as well. In our case, we use the OAI-PMH for harvesting metadata description of records. In the initial phase, after securing the infrastructure, installing DSpace, and configuring DSpace to act as a harvester, we use the Canadian repository platforms, the spreadsheet, to identify the platforms used across Canada. And we tested, and we were successful in harvesting records from institutional repositories built on DSpace using the DSpace intermediary format, Eprint using Dublin Core, Content DM using Dublin Core, Islandora using Dublin Core, and we also tested 2 custom IRs using Dublin Core. I think it's important to underscore that Canada Research Harvard collects only metadata. And an essential feature of the service is that can be restricted to specific name sets, as the harvester supports multiple configurable targets, which can be updated individually. The sets, of course, are defined at the repository level, and they're usually based on collections or types of objects. Soon after the solution of the national aggregator was adopted, the members of the Open Repositories Working Group recognized that we needed guiding documents to describe the harvesting process and the editing process for the Canadian repositories participating in the project. Therefore, we created 2 documents to accompany the service: the workflow for non-compliant Canadian repositories participating in OpenAIRE document, and how to edit records in Canada Research document. And we shared both documents with the Canadian repository managers community. The workflow for non-compliant Canadian repositories participating in OpenAIRE documents starts with a synopsis of the Canada Research Service. OpenAIRE, as you know, is aimed at linking the aggregated research publications to the accompanying funding and project information. So some curation of the records metadata is required to ensure that your records are visible and findable using the OpenAIRE services. And we delineated 2 possible scenarios for repositories being harvested by Canada Research on how to curate their metadata. In scenario 1, the repository manager curates the metadata in Canada Research. And once the records are harvested by Canada Research, the local repository manager is strongly encouraged to curate the metadata in the central aggregator in order to add granular funding information in compliance with the OpenAIRE guidelines. And the relevant fields containing funding information are funder identifier, funder name, funder grant, award title, and award URI. The pros for this scenario and the reasons why scenario 1 is our preferred scenario is that this option allows for adding granular funding information. And of course, the cons is that if the Canada research project comes to an end, the enhanced metadata may be lost, although we can offer a metadata export. The second scenario, the repository manager, in the second scenario, the repository the repository manager curates the metadata in the institutional repository and ensures that minimum metadata elements are included in the records in the local institutional repository so that the aggregator will pick up the changes at the next harvest. And the minimum metadata elements are, if applicable, of course, the funder name or ID, and those can go in the funding reference field, the DC description sponsorship, or the DC contributor field. And also, if applicable, grant or project name and number that can go in the funding reference, again, the DC description sponsorship or DC contributor field. The pros for this option is that the enhanced metadata stays with the original record, and you may already have this data in your records. And the cons is for a non-OpenAIRE compliant institutional repositories, this option does not allow adding granular funding information. And lastly, the document contains a note of caution. If a record is edited in Canada Research, then a new edit is performed on the same record in the institutional repository. The edits in the institutional repository will override the edits in Canada Research at the next scheduled harvest. Therefore, repository managers should be aware and take precautions to ensure that the records in Canada Research are reflected in the institutional repository. If you prefer the first scenario where the repository manager curates the metadata in Canada Research, we recorded in detail the editing process in the How to Edit Records in Canada Research document. And in order to edit metadata in Canada Research, you should be an admin for, or have admin privileges for the community or collection of your institution. And to get admin privileges, please send an email to OpenAIRE-adoption at car-abrc.ca. So there are some caveats. If you're not able to implement the minimum metadata requirements, of course, it can be harvested by Canada Research Aggregator, and the scope of the aggregator is to ensure that there's a pathway for non-compliant compliant Canadian repositories to have their records available through the OpenAIRE Explore Discovery service. However, because Canada Research will harvest only the metadata, it means that you will not be able to benefit from other value-added services offered by OpenAIRE, such as the OpenAIRE enhancement of your records, text and data mining that will identify funder affiliations, the OpenAIRE dashboard services, and the OpenAIRE usage statistics services. So if you wish to be harvested by Canada Research, please contact OpenAIRE-adoption at car-abrc.ca. You'll be sent a questionnaire that will help you prepare for harvesting, and it will help us set up the harvesting process. The information needed is the name of your institution, the name of the IR, the OAI PMH base URL for your IR, confirmation that the URL was validated using the OAI PMH validator, and there's a link to the validator in the form. And moreover, we need to know if harvesting should be restricted to specific name sets, so just a portion of your content or all content. We also need a name and contact details for follow-up and communication. The current status of the project, the site is live. It is customized with the McMaster branding. During the pilot phase, I harvested data from McMaster, McGill, and Ottawa. And we are looking for more IRs to test the workflow and the harvesting, and to expand the project to all Canadian institutional repositories. These are the resources that I used for today's presentation. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, and everyone else. That was great. I certainly learned a lot. I'll leave it to Pierre. I don't know if you want to monitor or see about any questions before we leave for the day. We do still have 5 minutes.
Okay, were there any questions in the Q&A?
No, nobody's put any in. They're probably still digesting what they all heard. But perhaps if anybody has a question now, you could put it in the Q&A or in the chat even. So there is a question in the Q&A. Not sure if this is a silly question, but how do you actually get all that funding information? Is this a manual process?
Is it a question for Canada Research, or if it's a local development in the ER? I would say if it's a local development for the ER, you basically you need to hope that OpenAIRE can cross and enrich your record. So this will be a way. Otherwise, I don't see any other way that manually adding in your ER this information. But what is needed to know is OpenAIRE is doing some processing, some enrichment, and as Tomasz shown for some record of spectrum, there's some founder information has been added to the record automatically by OpenAIRE without doing anything. One detail on this: the enrichment took place in the OpenAIRE graph only. So it's not going back to your ER right now, but it's something OpenAIRE wants to do, allow you to benefit from the enrichment and say, let's say we can go back and take back this information in our ER if we want. But this is a long-term development. For now, when you see an enrichment, it has been made in the OpenAIRE platform, not in your ER.
Yeah, that's how I understand it as well, that this is part of OpenAIRE's excellent deduping efforts in grabbing information that's available on various sites, and that in principle, authors are required to cite their funding upon publication. So that often appears in the text of the article. So that's probably where OpenAIRE would be getting that data. Don't know if there's other questions in our last 2 minutes or comments even, but we do hope you'll be joining us on December 10th. I did put the link in the chat.
Just this one thing, because don't we have some question for attendees? A survey poll?
Why, thank you. I totally forgot about that. Okay, yes, we have 2 very brief polls for you all to answer to keep things interesting here. And this will help us in planning for next, for the 10th. So first of all, if you would all indicate which repository software that you are running at your institution, and if it's not DSpace or Eprints, which we realize some of you aren't, if you would indicate in the chat which software you're using, then we'll know what we're dealing with to plan for the next session. So most of you have answered that, so I will end that and share the results. Not surprisingly, 14 out of 18 respondents use DSpace, 2 use Eprints, and then 2 use something else that may appear in the, here we go, one Islandora, and then there might be another one that will show up shortly. So let's see about the next poll. How do you plan on getting your content into OpenAIRE? So based on what you've heard today, based on what you knew previously, do you plan to get your repository to be OpenAIRE compliant directly? Or would you like to use the Canada Research Aggregator that Gabriela has mentioned or presented? Or are you still considering your options or other? If none of these apply, you can specify in the chat. Give you another second. All right, most of you have responded. So we have 8 repositories aiming to become OpenAIRE compliant, 1 that's currently considering the Canada Research Aggregator, and 6 who are unsure at present. And VIU potentially is already compliant. So we'll check in with you about that, Dana. Good to know which institutions in Canada are compliant. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our session, I believe. So thank you so much to all of our presenters today. Marc, Cyndie, Sophie, Tomasz, Gabriela, and Pierre. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you all again on December 10th with all your questions ready. Feel free to contact us in the meantime if you do have questions that you would like us to prepare answers to. Merci tout le monde. Goodbye.